Donald Trump's problem with trying to be an autocrat continues. And polling shows he's having trouble here. He's sagging at 39%. The immigration outrage is part of that. The LA Times reports all of this taking a toll, with crashing trust in our elections, concerns about misuse of ICE and other federal agents. 30% of the voters think the immigration officials might be at polling locations, including a larger share of minority Americans. And that matters because the belief by 46%, say, of perfectly lawful Hispanic American or Latino American voters that ICE could be there could be a reason to skip, which goes to the propaganda war that's also being waged, what is sometimes called, depending on the situation, voter suppression. Here's also what Trump is saying.
Why would you want mail-in ballots if you know it's corrupt? It's a corrupt system. We're the only country in the world that has this system of mail-in ballots. Think of it. The only country in the world that has this system of mail-in ballots because they cheat.
Fact check, false. This, along with the fear that Bannon and others are putting out about ICE agents roaming voter polling locations, may be this effort to distort everything or to undermine trust in mail voting. There are entire states that do only vote by mail. The president's claim that it is, quote, corrupt is not backed up by the experience in states, and Donald Trump himself has netted many, many votes for him through the mail. Meanwhile, we have the pictures of the East Wing ballroom. You can see that going up. Turns out allies on the board are approving the project, rejecting concerns about the size of this building. There's also an appointment of an assistant to the panel in charge of reviewing the plans, which is coming out of Trump's team. And if you look past the White House, Trump has directed his Air Force to repaint a VIP fleet in his preferred palette, while putting up pictures and posters and renamings all over the place in the federal government, something the New York Times recently said was more akin to what you see in dictatorships than democracies. We're joined now by former White House attorney in the first Trump administration, Ty Cobb. Welcome back.
Thank you, Ari. Good to be with you.
What do you see here as important in the signal to noise? And this attack on the midterms is, in your view, propaganda, trying to distort who turns out, or also getting ready to do something?
So I think if we go to 30,000 feet and look at all the pieces, keep in mind Trump recently said that it was time to nationalize elections. He articulated publicly that he thought the federal government should interfere in 15 jurisdictions or more. Steve Bannon promised that ICE would be out in droves at key precincts and in key states. And that Trump even went so far as to suggest at one point that we should forget about elections in 2026. Now, the White House, with regard to the latter statement, said that was a joke, but it's not a joke. I mean, this is all intended to desensitize America and to discredit voting, and it's had a big effect. I mean, the polls show that voters don't really anticipate that the elections in 2026 will go smoothly and or in a trustworthy manner, not because of mail-in ballots, but because of Republican interference and fascism suspected that will be at the polls. You've seen the judges, the courts on the immigration front have responded to the atrocities you have well mentioned and described on your show previously by revoking the presumption of regularity from the Department of Justice, basically saying that after 250 years, what the Justice Department says is no longer entitled to the presumption of truth. We're seeing a real decline. And now you talk about the ballroom, which I think is probably less of concern than the fascist efforts that are being undertaken with regard to elections and elsewhere, immigration. But with regard to the ballroom, what would you see? Frederick Law Olmsted, who designed D.C. and renowned figure in American history, was one of the first people on the commission that you just mentioned. And now we have a very, very young woman who looks like she recently escaped from homeroom to have her braces removed, has no experience at all, and she's now a Trump appointee. Why? Because she's one of Trump's secretaries. So it's a kakistocracy, as the word that gets tossed around. I know it's a a word I didn't know well, but it means governance by the inept, and that's what we're suffering through.
Yeah, as you say, inept and nepotism and patronage carrying more weight than anything else, which, as you know, is also the opposite of what Trump had famously claimed in his campaigns. He said that because he was wealthy, he would have less corruption incentive, and it was really the public officials that you have to worry about. It's the opposite. I want to show you Kristi Noem, who at one point might have been fighting for her job over all the ICE outrage, and she at DHS getting involved in the voting discussion. Take a listen.
When it gets to election day, that we've been proactive to make sure that we have the right people voting, electing the right leaders to lead this country.
Is that the proper approach of a security official? And related, what is your legal view of the limits on ICE under current law to be out in a way that might be voter intimidation in any voting period when we get to the midterms?
So that's an excellent question. I think we're going to see the courts gradually parse through that. ICE actually has no local law enforcement authority in any of the states. They're only supposed to manage the limited number of federal crimes entrusted to them, and they shouldn't be there. But it's going to take a series of court battles, I think, to prevent them from being there, and it may come down to a conflict between state National Guards and ICE, absent an implication of the Insurrection Act, which I think we will see in advance of the election. So I think people should be very, very concerned and very, very animated about what's coming. Garry Kasparov, of course, has the noted Russian dissident and former world chess champion, has been very outspoken about the gulags that are being built around the country, and the fact that they're intended not only to house, illegally detained immigrants, of which we have thousands now, but also likely dissidents and people of color on a going forward basis. What is happening in this country?
And you don't think that's just an international parallel gone too far? You believe that's something that Trump would try to do and get away with? So
I'll put it this way, Trump is deporting people on a trajectory and at a pace that's not very different from the number of deportations that happened under Obama. However, the number of illegally detained people is extraordinarily high, and he's building dozens of prisons to house up to 8,000 people. We've never needed that before. That's well over 150,000 beds. Who are they for? And who are they going to be for when the detainees are gone? This is, as Garry Kasparov says, this is not a drill.
Some of the pushback we've seen on the election front, Virginia redistricting goes forward, but the Supreme Court's considering an appeal. Florida voters suing to block Republicans trying the mid-decade redistricting, something that may violate the tradition, and different courts are figuring out whether to allow that kind of constitutional hardball. Supreme Court is letting California use what is a Democratic-friendly congressional map, which in that state they won famously only pushing back on what MAGA had tried. How do you view that as a kind of a signal to what courts will do with what could be the more emergency problems on a faster basis going into the midterms that you were outlining?
So I think that the California decision by the Supreme Court is basically part and parcel of their decision in Texas, which they'd made earlier, allowing the Republicans to move forward with redistricting. And there's really no distinction between the two decisions and the reasoning, even though Trump, of course, championed the Texas redistricting, but criticized the California because it's Democrats and Republicans. That's not the way the country's supposed to be governed. It's supposed to be governed as a unified system of people for all the people. With regard to the other patchwork quilt of states, you have maybe 5 states, maybe 6 actually, with things in play. I think the reality there, though, is it's coming a little late in the game, and there will be appeals and delays, and that gets right up against the Supreme Court's precedent about, they're not going to make changes late in the game. So I'm not sure how consequential any of these current efforts will be. And And then you look at Trump's lies about, the perils of mail-in voting. I mean, Florida probably has the most mail-in votes of any state in the country. It's a Republican bastion. I don't think there's any basis for that. But the level of election interference isn't just in terms of the SAVE Act, which is of course just another fascist brick in the prison that's being built around us, but it's in what's going on in the Fulton County case. The Fulton County case where the feds went in and, notwithstanding legal proceedings in the state involving the same ballots, disrupted all that. Submitted an affidavit, which I don't know a single legal person who's reviewed the affidavit who believes that there's actual probable cause in there. In fact, the case agent who filed the affidavit noted that that he was basically relying on deficiencies cited by a Trump denier, Kurt Olson, a Trump election denier, Kurt Olson, who represented Carrie Lake in Arizona trying to contest her election, failed, and is flailed with a bunch of allegations that back in 2020, Bill Barr told Trump, were just false. So now he's recycling these, and the case agent pointed out that with regard to the allegations in the indictment, they could only be a crime if there was evidence, not citing evidence, but saying this is only a crime if there is evidence. And that is not the standard for issuing warrants. So we're seeing a full-scale onslaught in the courts and the legislatures, and presumptively, based on what Trump has promised and Bannon has promised, we'll see ICE in the streets trying to intimidate witnesses and prevent the elections from going smoothly in blue states and key precincts.
According to documents reviewed by MS Now, the Department of Homeland Security's Chief Investigations Arm this week launched a broader nationwide campaign to investigate and prosecute naturalized citizens who may have improperly voted in past elections before they became citizens. This is a plan ordered by the White House. As part of its investigation, MS Now has also learned that senior DHS and Justice Department appointees have held a series of meetings to discuss sending law enforcement to polling places to, quote, secure elections. Law enforcement agents tell MS Now they worry the administration's true goal is to intimidate voters from showing up in future elections. Two current and former DHS officials told MS Now they have never heard of an initiative like this being run by the department ever before, calling it not normal. Carol Leonnig is a senior investigative reporter for MS Now. She is the author of Injustice: How Politics and Fear Vanquished America's Justice Department. She was the lead reporter on that story about DHS hunting for voters, and she joins me now. Carol, it's good to see you. We have heard so much. I think Walz told me, Newsom told me, Pritzker told me they were worried about federal agents showing up at polls on Election Day. It sounds like now there may actually be a plan in place to have some version of that.
Well said, Jacob. I feel like I've been hearing from sources just like you have for a long time that they're really worried and have been worried about an effort to kind of chill and frighten people away from the polls. And here we have two ways in which that looks like it's coming true. First, the issue of a broad national investigation of open and closed investigations into possible fraudulent voting by naturalized citizens. Let's break that down. When the HSI, which is the investigative arm of DHS, goes about these investigations, what do? They send letters and they conduct interviews with naturalized citizens asking them, when did you vote? When did you register to vote? Let me see your paperwork to determine that you're a naturalized citizen. Doesn't take very long for you to frighten somebody who's basically gotten through a legal asylum process, an immigration process, about themselves, their family, their status, and all of their friends, and all of their family members, and all of their community. This is viewed as a way to ask a lot of questions, stir up a lot of dust in 50 states, all led by the Department of Homeland Security. And then we'll see if maybe fewer people show up to the polls. The second part, which I'm so glad you focus on, is about armed law enforcement. We are hearing about a series of meetings, and we reported it first today for MS Now, that DHS and DOJ officials have been conducting over the last several weeks to basically plot and plan how to send armed law enforcement to the polls. As you know very well, Jacob, you know this material, it is against federal law to send the military or armed law enforcement within 1,000 feet of the polls in any way that would intimidate voters. This has been one of the biggest fears of Democratic activists and free and fair election advocates. And here we now know it's essentially in the works.
You cite, Carol, in this report, multiple sources who tell you that the driving force behind the sweeping HSI investigations, which, by the way, HSI is normally investigating human trafficking, sex trafficking, other forms of illicit activity that basically in which people are the victims. You say is White House Deputy Chief of Staff Stephen Miller. Talk about what Stephen Miller's role is here. Why does it concern insiders so much?
So what's so interesting about this is it's not typical for the White House Deputy Chief of Staff to be telling the Department of Homeland Security and the Department of Justice what to do about potential violations of law. But Miller is viewed by both the DHS sources I spoke to and DOJ sources as the architect and the driving force between this effort to investigate naturalized citizens, to figure out, did they vote before they were naturalized? Did they register to vote before they were naturalized? Did they make any mistakes that could be claimed to be fraud in their paperwork? And that they, at DHS at least, have been having weekly conference calls with Miller and his staff about doing this. As well, we learned today in our reporting that the DHS has been asked to essentially report back to the White House directly when they decide not to charge some of these individuals who are viewed as suspected fraud voters. Any open or closed cases that they're asked to review. Now, if they choose not to charge someone, they've got to tell the White House, which is, again, unprecedented for any law enforcement activity.
Carol, what are the number of people potentially that we're talking about? Am I right that I read in your reporting it was around 1,000 for starters? And what does that mean in the larger scheme of things? We have tens of millions, hundreds of millions of people in this country, tens of millions who are voting, maybe more. This is about, ultimately, it seems, the impact that will have on people that are beyond this 1,000 people, I guess is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah. No, really smart question. So in the timeline of our reporting, and my colleague Laura Lopez and Vaughn Hilliard were critical to this. Let me just give them a shout out. In this reporting, what we learned was that in the summer of 2025, HSI was given a list of 1,700 potentially or suspected fraudulent voters who were either foreign-born citizens, immigrants in the process of becoming naturalized citizens, 1,700 cases. But that rapidly expanded as of this memo that we reviewed that came out on Friday, in which there are potentially hundreds of thousands of naturalized citizens that will be reviewed. The White House, by the way, I want to emphasize something. When we spoke to White House spokesperson Abigail Jackson, she said, look, it's fair for the administration to be looking for criminals, people who are engaged in fraudulent voting. The problem with that is that all of the research done, including by the pro-Trump Heritage Foundation, have concluded that over the course of a decade, there were only 24 identifiable cases of non-citizen voter fraud. So, expanding to look at further and further and further concentric circles to try to find fraudsters when so far there are so few is raising a lot of hackles with people who want to protect the election and protect voters from being intimidated.
Caroline, incredible reporting as always. Thank you so much for joining me tonight.
Thank you, Jacob.
Joining us, Democratic Senator Mark Warner of Virginia. He is the vice chairman of the Intelligence Committee. You know a whole lot more than I do about this, sir. What can you tell us?
Well, Katie, I think it's appropriate that the president has all the options on the table. But we saw when he has such a confusing foreign policy, we don't know what's going to happen. We know a month and a half ago, or when the Iranian people were on the streets in massive numbers, and the regime was so repressive, and he promised he was going to do something then. He couldn't do that then because we didn't have forces, because the aircraft carrier was off the coast of Venezuela on another military mission as opposed to being in the Eastern Mediterranean. And our ability to leverage our allies in the region, and particularly in Europe, they were all distracted by his follies around Greenland. I can tell you now, if I hope these negotiations go well, but having just come back from the Munich Security Conference, where there is great questions about, what is the American foreign policy? Are we going to be a dependable partner? If we were to take action against Iran, our ability to really put pressure on the regime, and the regime is awful, is really going to be undercut by the fact that our Europeans who have diplomatic relations with Iran, that have business relations that could put more pressure on as well, I'm not sure they're going to be fully there because of their uncertainty about the president's overall foreign policy approach. So we may have our armed forces in the region, and again, never take that option off the table, but our ability to have some kind of concentrated, coordinated effort with allies in the region and allies in Europe, as opposed to simply United States and Israel acting alone, is really going to be undermined.
Let me play one of your colleagues, Senator Graham, talking about what is happening right now with the president regarding Iran.
There is no light or gaps between President Trump and Bibi about what to do and how to do it. There are two lines in the water right now. One's a diplomatic line, trying to find a way to end this regime diplomatically that will advance our national security interest. The other line is the military option. I think President Trump is looking for which line can catch the biggest fish. The bottom line is we're into weeks, not months, in terms of decision making.
Help me understand Lindsey Graham there. By the way, he's in Israel saying this. And it's not him saying that this is a nuclear sites agreement or pulling back on the nuclear capacity. It's him saying that the president wants this regime to end, and he's going to take whichever option is going to get him farther along the line to that end.
Well, let's go through this for a moment. First of all, remember the president said in our previous bombing that we had obliterated Iran's nuclear program. While clearly our military did an exquisite job, we did not obliterate Iran's nuclear program, number one. Number two, if the president is calling for regime change in Iran, and there's an awful regime, but he should make the case to the American public and to the world of how we're going to go about doing that. And to say we're doing it solely alone with Israel, without even what may be the views of those states in the region, the Saudis, the Emiratis, the Qataris, and others, whether they are going to be collaborating or not. Remember when when Iran struck back against Israel, for example, early on, stopping some of those missiles, it wasn't just the Israelis and the Americans, it also included the Jordanians, the Brits, the French, and others. And we now, if we're going to do this without potential allies and friends in the Middle East and without our friends in Europe, my fear is, while we all would like the Iranian regime to be gone, are we putting American forces in too much harm's way because we don't have kind of our natural allies all on our side on this? So I'd like to hear the plan. I'd like to have it cleared out. I hate the idea that the American foreign policy is being going to somehow be dictated by the Bibi Netanyahu government. I strongly, strongly support Israel, but I sure as heck don't always agree with the Bibi Netanyahu government. This sounds like a bit of bluster at times when this is a dangerous situation. We all agree the Iranian regime needs to cut back, but this kind of non-coordinated approach is not going to get us where I hope we need to be.
And the Iranians are, by the way, we can put up some of the social media messages from the Ayatollah. The Iranians are saying, they're making their own threats. It doesn't sound like we're in the middle of negotiations, frankly. They're threatening their own force and sinking our warships and putting them at the bottom of the ocean. But I'm just hoping you can give this to me a little bit straighter, because you have a good relationship with Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State. You say you want to see plans for what's happening. So it sounds like you haven't seen anything much from this administration. But how actually concerned are you that there are currently plans for a military operation in Iran? And do you believe that those plans are just, pie in the sky plans, or are they actionable plans that the administration is ready to use?
Katie, I don't know. I'd like to say, well, I've been briefed, and I just can't tell you. I don't know. Now, a president always has the rights to take action, but normally normally when he doesn't brief Congress, or at least the Gang of Eight, that's because there is some emergency that precipitates a quick action, and then you notify or brief right afterwards. And we've seen in the case of this administration, not even notification at times to the Democrats, which is totally inappropriate. And then on top of that, if this is part of a strategic plan to not brief congressional leadership, I think is a mistake. I think it goes against all norms and practices of other administrations, including Trump's first administration. And if we are thinking about this and not including our European or moderate Arab nations, Iran still has capabilities. Clearly, Iran has been on the back foot after their proxies at Hezbollah and Syria have been set back. Clearly, the Iranian regime is horribly unpopular with the Iranian people. And gosh, seeing regime change would make sense, but we don't have the level of inside knowledge. Now, Israel's got better knowledge than we do about what's going on the ground in Iran, but there are a number of other countries in the region that would have some ideas about what next. Should the regime or certain peoples in the regime move on? I'm not sure we're getting all that input, because I can tell you, coming out of the Munich Security Conference, when not only Europeans but players from around the world who traditionally we have called on as allies, and that we also oftentimes use their intelligence as well, people were rightfully pretty damn pissed off at this president. And, for example, his callous comments about European nations that lost soldiers in Iraq and Afghanistan supporting our troops, and callously being, that sacrifice being disregarded by this president, or the craziness around Greenland. The idea that that he is going to launch a war with just Israel at our side is not in the best interest of the United States at this point, without trying to build up alliances, without also, frankly, having consultation with Congress.
Let's talk about Munich a little bit more. The reports out of Munich were not good. Take lawmakers and politicians out of it. The reports from journalists who have good, deep relationships with officials overseas, the reports have not been good. I want to play Zanny Minton-Betters, the Economist editor-in-chief on Morning Joe, talking about what she took away from the Munich Security Conference.
I think in Europe, there's a very strong sense that I got from the days in Munich and indeed before in Davos. All this idea of what people call the global world order, the US-led over, it is over. The West, I think, is over as a concept, in the sense that there are significant differences now between what the United States administration wants and what many people in Europe want. And it is important to be realistic about that.
All right, so the West is over. NATO is over. Is that what you took away as well?
I took away that at the basis of, and as Zanny said, this is an American established world order post-World War II. Other nations benefit from it, absolutely. And I agree with the president, the Europeans should pay more for their defense. But we benefit from this in enormous ways, militarily, financially, having the dollar being the leading global currency. This is a two-way street. And at the end of the day, it was based not simply on a document, for example, that established NATO. It was built upon a trust relationship. And that trust relationship has been so severed. I mean, in many ways, the most striking was some of our Canadian colleagues. I mean, and the idea that somehow Canada now views China potentially as a more stable long-term partner than America, that is not in America's best interest. And what we were doing, and virtually everybody, Democrat and Republican alike, was saying, hey, we still believe in this relationship. We still think we're stronger together. Please, we still like you guys. And, and they would say, well, that's fine. You as Congress may be individually, but what about your president?
Yeah.
And why haven't you pushed back more? And I couldn't respond when you say, why hasn't Congress pushed back more? Because some of the Republicans that were there were pushing back. But the fact that so many Republicans have simply gone along with this, I think, slightly loose cannon, undirected foreign policy from this president, where we burn our enemies, is flabbergasting me. I mean, could someone, I know this is not the subject right now, but could somebody explain to me what this country's policy, this administration's policy is towards China right now? Are they a competitor? Are we going to sell our most advanced chips? Or only with companies where Americans got a stake in the chip companies, where we get revenues? Has this totally moved away from where Trump won and Biden and Obama about the long-term threats from China?
Well, they're not being persuaded to back a fascist. They're not being persuaded to back a regime that is occupying American cities, that is starting unnecessary foreign entanglements, that is trampling on the Constitution. They're not into that, Michael. I think you know that. I think everybody paying attention knows that. And anybody who's been watching the election returns for the last 15 months in special elections and off-year elections has seen that. The regime is being crushed every time there are free and fair elections, which is why I believe they are ramping up threats against our democratic infrastructure, because they are worried about free and fair elections taking away their power, and they don't want a fair fight. They do not want a fair fight. The bad news for them is that's not up to them. That is not up to them. And part of the point of showing up with the largest protest in history on March 28th, as I believe we will do for No Kings 3, is to show them and everybody else that democracy is reasserting itself whether they like it or not.
I fundamentally agree with you on the democracy argument and the rejection of fascism. I also think this conversation would be different, Ezra, if the economy were working for everyday Americans. We know in our own lived experience, anecdotally, it is not. It's also what voters are saying in polling. This is an AP NORC poll. The question was, do you approve or disapprove of the way Donald Trump is handling his job as president? That number was 62% disapprove, 36% approving. And it's interesting to me because those numbers almost exactly mirror, Ezra, the question on the economy. What share of Americans approve of the president's job? Wait, this is asking the same question, right? There was an economy question in here somewhere. You get the idea, though, which is like, I think it is a 1-2 punch. And I think that's part of what you saw in Virginia and in New Jersey. You lead with affordability, you talk about the economy, but you land on this question of democracy.
Alicia, you took the words out of my mouth. It's something we say at Indivisible all the time, this 1-2 punch. Because Trump won in 2024 on the argument that he wasn't part of the status quo, that he was going to lower the price of eggs and bread, that he was going to get you a better job, that he was going to make the economy work for you. And part of the argument is the affordability argument. He's not doing any of that. He's clearly not doing that. People are not better off now than they were before. But the other part is, why isn't he doing any of that? He's not doing any of that because he's focusing on enriching himself, on attacking Venezuela or Greenland, on terrorizing the Twin Cities. What is he up to? It makes no sense. Why would this guy deserve more power, another 2 years of Congress? That's an easy argument to make because it makes sense to everybody watching what's going on. And when we show up in force on March 28th with massive nonviolent protests, we put a spotlight on all the random other stuff he's doing rather than focusing on improving your life. And as we head into the general election, exactly as you said, 1-2 punch. He wants to be a king to enrich himself. He's selling you out. He's not doing anything for you. And that's a message that resonates with Democrats, resonates with independents, and registers with Republicans who voted for Trump hoping for something that they haven't gotten.
Yeah, I mean, look, President Obama has been in the news, obviously, as of late this week. He was at the All-Star game this weekend. But people forget many of the voters that voted for President Obama turned out and then voted for then President Trump in that 2016 election. So there is some connective tissue there. You told Mother Jones that we, as in Indivisible, are developing organizational capacity that allows us to pull off historic levels of engagement in between these tentpole events. So the No Kings protest is not just about the protest one day, just the one march. But I do think it is filling a gap and a void that people have. There are a lot of people that are fired up, that are paying attention. This idea that the voters aren't paying attention, I think it's a bunch of BS. There are some people that are paying attention, but they're not as engaged. But there are a lot of Americans that are very engaged and looking for somewhere to put their energy, and they're not just trying to wait until the next election.
Look, I think that's really important. One thing that really bugs me, and I see Democrats do this sometimes too. They see a big crowd of people out in an off year and they say, all you people, remember to vote. And the response of the people in the crowd is like, what are you talking about, vote? There's a fascist in the White House and the election is a year away, or in this case, a little bit less than a year away. Give me something to do right now to stand up for my community. Give me something that I can do to actually show that I'm standing up for my rights. And what I think about on that, Simone, is 2 days after the murder of Alex Preddy in the Twin Cities, one reaction you could imagine that is people all over the country see that and say, oh, I don't want any of that. I'm going to stay home. I'm going to keep myself safe. I'm going to keep my head down. I'm not going to do anything in public that shows I'm against this regime. We offered a training, Eyes on ICE training, to train people on how to do exactly what Alex Preddy was doing, exactly what Renee Good was doing. Exercising their First Amendment rights to stand up in defense of their neighbors. We had more than 200,000 people join that training 2 days after Alex Preddy's murder. People are hungry to be part of the fight for democracy right now. No Kings is a big day protest. I think it's very important. But to your point, it's a one-day protest. That's not how we save democracy. It is a tool for growing the movement of people who are going to stand up in their own community in places like Gustavus, Alaska, population 665, or Coloma, California, population 372, Elkton, Oregon, population 183. Elkton, Oregon has a No Kings protest on the map for March 28th. There are going to be thousands of these events in blue states, in red states, in purple states, in urban communities, suburban communities, rural communities, because people want to be part of something in this moment. We're trying to give them an easy on-ramp to being part of something meaningful.
Well, I think that's an important aspect of this, Ezra. And, you know, I love the work. I applaud the work because it does, to Simone's point and question around engagement and what that looks like, means something. We've got about 30 seconds left. We got 1,000 events.
We have more than 1,000 events.
What does that translate into participation? What do you feel that's going to be, given the initial 2.5, now then 5 million people? What does this feel like for you?
Well, let me give you a sense of the trajectory. 3 million people at 1,300 events for Hands Off. 5 million people at 2,100 events for No Kings 1. 7 million people at 2,700 events for No Kings 2. We are currently on track to exceed No Kings 2. I promised y'all twice before the largest protest in history. I've proven that right in No Kings 1 and No Kings 2. I'm promising you again, this is going to be the largest protest in American history. It's going to be the largest protest in Twin Cities history, where the flagship event is. You can count on it, because I know people around the country are ready to do this.